one of the foremost advocates for wrongful convictions in the United States. He is on the board of the Innocence Project, and he has gotten more people out of wrongful convictions than anybody I know, that's for sure. And he's very humble about it, and will say he just played a role here and there. But he is a passionate advocate. Tell me how you got interested in this.
It was a serendipitous situation, which was that I opened up a newspaper that I didn't normally read. I think it was the Daily News, but I was on my way to play tennis, something you can certainly relate to. And I wanted something to read. And the Times was sold out, and I grabbed the News, and there was a story in there, the News or the Post, about a kid named Stephen Lennon who was serving 15 years to life for a nonviolent first offense cocaine possession charge in a maximum security prison in New York State. You know, I thought I was reading the wrong story. I was like, I don't even understand how this could be. I didn't know anything about mandatory sentencing cases back then. And, you know, I had struggled with substance abuse as a teenager and into my 20s. So, you know, I sort of thought, wow, you know, there but for the grace of, you know, who knows what go I, right? And it really hit me. And I decided I had to try to do something about it if I could. And I was too naive to know that this was a virtually impossible thing to do. But I called the only criminal defense attorney I knew. It was a guy named Bob Kalina. He represented some of the rock acts that I had signed, including Stone Temple Pilots and Skid Row, and they were getting arrested, you know, weekly. So I had him on speed dial. So I called Bob and I said, Bob, you know, is there anything you can do? He said, there's nothing you can do. It's Rockefeller drug laws. This is just there's thousands of cases like this. What do you want? And I said, well, do me a favor, talk to the. So he talked to the mother. Stephen's mother. It was the kid's name was Stephen Lennon. His mother's name was in the article. She had been advocating for clemency for him from Governor Mario Cuomo, and had recently been turned down. And it made the newspaper because she had gotten some very high-level support from some very prominent people, including Geraldine Ferraro. And so that's why I was in the paper. I asked Bob to talk to Shirley, the mom. He did. He agreed to take the case pro bono. And even though he said it was hopeless, we ended up at a courtroom 6 months later in Malone, New York, which is right up on the Canadian border. And they brought this kid, Stephen, in shackles like he was Charles Manson or something. Nonviolent first offense, remember. The arguments went back and forth, and I didn't really know what I was experiencing or listening to, but I did know that I was sitting there holding Mrs. Lennon's hand with her husband standing on the other side of her, and when the judge banged the gavel down and said the motion is granted, that was it. I mean, that was the greatest feeling I'd ever had outside the birth of my daughter at that time. It was that lightning bolt moment. You know how that is, and I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to do more of that. I didn't know how to, but I knew I was going to try to figure it out.
When you enter the court system as a guy like you're describing, he was how old at the time?
31 or 32, and he had been in for 8+ years already. So I guess he was in his early 20s when he was arrested.
So this guy's in his early 20s. And I think this is really prominent for people that don't have education or income. My point is, you go into the court system and the whole thing is stacked up to, number one, intimidate you, and number two, violate the rights that you're actually told that you're going to get. Think about it. If you're a kid, particularly a nonviolent first offender, you walk in there and what do you see? Well, the judge is elevated. You know, he's up on a bench. He's got flags on both sides of him. He's got a big seal behind him. Everything looks super official.
Robe. He's got a robe.
Yeah, he's in the robe. And he's sitting up looking down. He's got armed guards on either side of him. They call them bailiffs, but they're armed guards, and you can find out exactly how armed they are if you do something that they don't like. Then the prosecutor comes in, and he's in that court every day. So he knows that judge. They're on a first-name basis, and the court reporter is on a first-name basis with everybody. Then you come in.
And the judge probably used to be a prosecutor because we know that about 80% of judges in America are former prosecutors.
Of course. And they're all wearing suits and they can stand, but you remain seated. And then they bring you up if you testify, which most of the time they tell you not to do because they think you're going to be an idiot. And in a lot of cases, they probably might be better off to not testify, but you're sitting down and they start talking about your life. The lawyers are all in power suits. They're standing up, walking around, and you're sitting there like, what the hell? So the most important time of your life is in a very foreign setting. And I always say, if you're going to have a battle and you're going to have any chance of winning, you need to pick your battles. You need to pick your battlefield. You need to pick the time. You need to pick the circumstance. You get to do none of that in this situation. And then if you stub your toe and you get a guilty verdict, or you get bad advice from a public defender and take a plea deal, then you hit these mandatory sentences. I don't know how many there are now, but we've got people in, first offenders, nonviolent, on drug charges in states where it's now legal.
Right. We've got people serving life in states where it's now legal.
Where it's no longer a crime.
Right. I mean, and that sounds like wait, what are you talking about? Like, what planet are we on? That makes no damn sense. When you have a system that processes as many people as we do, it is impossible for it to work the way it's supposed to. And it wasn't always like this, right? We had a system where 35 years ago, we had 300,000 something people in prison and jail in America. Now we have 2.2 million. The system's not designed to be able to handle that kind of caseload.
Why is that jump from 300,000 to 2.2 million?
There's a number of reasons for that. It started with Nixon's war on drugs, right? And, we know now because, Haldeman, right? His aide that came out just the last year or two and said that President Nixon wasn't actually interested in drugs, but he wanted to declare a war on black people and hippies, and he couldn't call it that. So he came up with a different idea, I don't want to say clever, but a devious plan to call it something other than what it was. And at the time, no one cared about drugs in America. It wasn't even in the top 50 of concerns of the general public. Police departments also didn't care about it. And when they found out that police departments didn't want to go around and arrest people for low-level drug crimes, they created these incentive plans, right, where they would give federal money to the police departments in exchange for them meeting quotas of arresting people, mostly young people, and charging them with these low-level drug crimes. So, of course, that was the first thing that exploded the prison population. And then the politicians started passing these mandatory sentencing laws, and they got worse and worse. It was very difficult at that time for a Democrat, and still is, I guess, for anyone to stand up and say, I think we should lower the drug laws or lower these laws or lessen sentences. And then they'd be afraid to get called out and called soft on crime. And, of course, when Dukakis was running for president, it was leading by a lot. And the Bush team came up with this idea that they would sort of launch this ad that was so diabolical, right? They took one case of a guy who was on a furlough in a program when he was the governor of Massachusetts and then had gone and committed an awful crime. When they said, that one case proves that this guy, wants to let everybody out of prison and wants to, and it was an early progenitor of what we have now, where we try to demonize people and we try to, politicians take individual cases and try to scare everyone into passing these stricter and harsher and more conservative, I guess you could say, laws that end up doing nothing but locking up generations of people, mostly people of color. It's a national shame, and I think the pendulum is finally swinging back in the other direction now, certainly on the state level, and hopefully we'll see more progress on the federal level, but it's way overdue, and the number of lives that have been destroyed and the number of families that have been destroyed. Everyone that goes to prison, Doc, is somebody's family member, right? Those people are moms, dads, uncles, aunts, sons and daughters. They may be grandparents. And the whole family goes through terrible hardship when they're, especially if it's somebody who's the breadwinner, but if it's a mom or anyone, goes to prison. And then the cycle continues.
You woke up on the first day of your senior year in high school and sadly discovered that your mother and father had been brutally stabbed and bludgeoned. Your mother, Arlene, was dead. Your father, Seymour, he was fighting for his life. And you called 911 and gave first aid to him, but he later succumbed, correct?
And that is all correct, yes.
Tell us what happened from that point forward. You wake up that morning, you find them.
After calling 911, law enforcement showed up at my house pretty quickly. I had some family members who showed up, but I was isolated. I was separated. And instead of me going to the hospital where I wanted to go, or my family demanded I go, I was taken to police headquarters. And instead of being with my family, my father, I was interrogated for countless hours. The interrogation wasn't audio recorded, there was no video, there was no stenographic transcript of it. And after countless hours, the detective said, I confess to the brutal murder of my mother and the attempted murder of my father at that moment. And I was arrested. And that was the last day I saw freedom for several weeks until I was given bail.
Now, you were taken to the police station and you were interrogated for countless hours. How many hours are we talking about here?
We really don't know. I mean, because all I remember, it was brought in when it was light out. And when I finally left, it was dark out. And since law enforcement chose to be deceptive, dishonest, a lot of the record keeping wasn't accurate. But we would say that the interrogation was probably anywhere from 6 to 10 hours if we had to give an estimate. And a windowless room, no food, no water, no contact to the outside world other than, well-seasoned homicide detectives.
As a 17-year-old kid being hammered by these professional interrogators in a windowless room with no food, emotionally torn down because you know what's happened to your mother and father, take me through that moment when he tells you your father has just identified you as the attacker.
For people to understand, you gotta have to understand being, isolated, separated. You're being told that, that these law enforcement who I was brought up to believe in and trust in were telling me that they had evidence of my hair in my mother's hands. And then all of a sudden, McCready does this fake phone call where he comes in, he goes, listen, Marty, he goes, we know you did this murder. They just pumped your father full of adrenaline and he identified you. And at that very moment, you kind of the world just comes crushing down on you. There's this disbelief. And I said, there's no way my father would say that. I said, the only reason why he would say something like this is because I helped perform 911 on the first aid that morning. And McCready goes, kind of stop the bullshit, Marty. We know you did it. Your father just said you did it. Just tell us you did it. And that's kind of how they get false confessions. They have you starting to believe their lies. And you kind of almost fight with your own brain because you know what the truth is. And for me, being this innocent kid, growing up trusting law enforcement, here I have law enforcement telling me that what I know to be true isn't true.
Valentino, for you, it was 27 years, right?
Yeah, 27 years. False imprisonment.
How old was your daughter when you went in?
4 months old.
When you get out, she's a grown woman, right?
Yes. She's when I get out, she's 28.
What do you say to yourself about it right now as you sit there?
Well, I'm a blessed man. Right now I'm sitting in my car. My daughter's running a restaurant 5 feet away with my grandkids. And and hold on. And she became a school teacher. So, mine turned out a little different than other people's because, but I went in at 21, Dr. Phil, and I walked out at 48 years old, and I'm a strong believer in God. So God had a purpose for me. You won't believe this. And I put this in my book. In prison, they used to call me the Black Dr. Phil. Okay? Because I had read over 600 books and everybody came to me for advice.
Yeah. You're wearing your hair the right way. I can say that.
Thank you.
So people understand August 10th, 91, a late night fight broke out at a gathering outside of Louis' Texas Red Hot restaurant at the intersection of East Delavan and Bailey Avenue in Buffalo, New York. Now, this Toriano Jackson was shot and killed. They got an anonymous tip, and the police arrested you for the murder and for shooting at 3 other people. But it was just 2 days after your arrest that Lamar Scott confessed to the news media that he, in fact, shot and killed Jackson. What happened then?
It's supposed to be a no-brainer, What happened then is that took his statement and they kicked him out of the police station and told him to get his lies straight.
Get his lie straight.
Yeah, they didn't believe him.
Well, is this just confirmation bias? Do they just lock in on this and they don't want to see or hear anything else?
I would say absolutely yes, because if you look at, a lot of the empirical evidence on wrongful convictions, we've seen so many innocent people go to prison, and later on, when the facts come out, we discover that the law enforcement had evidence that pointed to someone else, not the person that was convicted. And I think it's confirmation bias. I think it's institutional blinders. I think it's also a sense of, if we reveal the truth, what's going to happen to some of our other cases? We'll all of a sudden we open Pandora's box. And, we know with Louis Scarcella, who was on the Dr. Phil show with you, and we see what happened with him in all the cases that he was involved with. So I think that's a perfect example how there's this level of protecting their own mistakes. And when all of a sudden, it's hard to call it a mistake. It's more of an intentional act, that we discover the intentional wrongdoing, the intentional act. It's deeper than just one case.
I'm really curious, and I think our listeners and viewers are curious about what you were saying at the time when the shooter was saying he did it and they were ignoring him and prosecuting you.
Well, Dr. Phil, I come from a very bad neighborhood, a lot of stuff going on there. And I had to ask myself, was I in the twilight zone? Because up until now, I've been around a lot of people in the hood, as they would say, that do some awful things. I grew up with a lot of these people, but I never knew that these type of humans existed. Someone that would actually get on the stand and lie about a murder case. It was later proved that they were coerced by the prosecution, but also I had 8 witnesses that cleared me. So it was over 90 people that witnessed the shooting, Dr. Phil. So it was at a public restaurant. And, you just can't ignore that type of evidence. 8 eyewitnesses. And I took a polygraph test and passed it.
Did this get to you emotionally? Were you angry? Were you depressed? Were you helpless? I mean, how did you feel?
Well, what happened was this, it took me 7 years to get my focus and normalcy to a certain extent back. 7 years. And it wasn't until my uncle sent me some colored pencils and some paper, and he says, hey, if you can reclaim your talent, you can reclaim your life. And I started drawing. And the drawing for the next 20 years is what kept me strong, what kept me going.
Art was important to you before this all happened, right?
Oh, yeah. I went to performing arts for art, and, I've been drawing since 4 years old. I won an art contest, but for 7 years, I hadn't drawn anything, painted anything. And it wasn't until my uncle sent me those supplies that my spirit started growing, because prison's a place designed to break your spirit. And, I took to the art again and it saved my life. I've always had a great spirit. I've always loved everybody. I get along with everybody. And prison didn't change that for me. I had my moments where I was bitter and angry and everything, but I can still wake up in the morning and smile and laugh, man. I'm not harping on that stuff. I'm just glad that I made it out. Too many of my friends didn't make it out. Some of them committed suicide.
Did you ever consider that?
Oh, yeah, man. At least once or twice a year, but I knew that I had a bigger purpose, and that's what kept me going.
And what was your bigger purpose?
My bigger purpose was to make my family proud, to leave a legacy, and to change the world in some small way. And I mean, I talk to kids now about making the right choices in the inner city. All of these kids going to prison where I come from, and so for me, that's more fulfilling than anything in the world. And I was also there to help guys get their GED, because I was one of the educated ones, to help guys get their GED, to counsel them about making the right choices upon being released. So, hey, for me, it was, I'm blessed, man. That's all I can say.